Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Discussions of Racial Equity in Adult Education. This is part one of a two-part series that we're offering during Black History Month to talk about racial equity. For those of you who may not know me, I am Don Finn. I am the current president of the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and I also serve as the publications chair. Let me tell you a little bit about COABE for those of you who might not know. COABE is the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and it is, we represent 65,000 adult education practitioners across the country. We are a membership-based organization, and we currently have roughly 28,000 active members in the adult education field. Today's webinar is really, it's come about from our COABE Journal, the latest edition, that's focusing on racial equity and immigrant integration. The COABE Journal actually went through a bit of a transition. We're actually in our third year now of having a little bit different focus for the journal. The journal itself now is focusing more on voices from the field and to provide practical insights and information for our adult educators across the country. We have themed editions that we offer, and actually the racial equity and immigrant integration issue is one that the team came up with really in the summer. We already had a plan in place, but we determined that in light of not only COVID-19, but also in light of the national exposure to racial equity issues and highlighting racial equity issues and immigrant immigration issues, that we felt it was necessary to reach out to the field to solicit articles and contributions from folks in the field. And so that was the genesis of this edition of the journal. And I am just so pleased that we have the opportunity to offer these webinars. We have the webinar today, and then we have another webinar that is scheduled for Tuesday, February 23rd, which will feature additional authors from the racial equity and immigrant integration excuse me, of the edition of the journal. Sorry, lots of bells and whistles going off on the screen here. So during the presentation, if as we're hearing from our two panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box, which is located on the screen there. Please don't use the chat for questions, but rather use the Q&A for questions. And actually, I encourage you to take a little time to listen to each of our participants first as you are formulating your questions. Each of them are going to have between 10 and 15 minutes to just talk a little bit about their piece and the relationship to adult education and also the themed issue of racial equity and immigrant integration. Okay, so moving right along, today's presenters, we are very happy to have Dr. Carmens Story, who is the president and CEO of Aspire Consulting Services. She wrote a reflective piece, a self-reflective piece for the COABE Journal. And we have Dr. Charisse Moore, who is a Principal Technical Assistance Consultant at the American Institutes for Research. So welcome to you both. And I'm going to go ahead and going to start with Carmen. Carmen, it's good to see you again. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. Would you go ahead and tell us just a little bit about yourself and your work in adult education?
Absolutely. So I've been working in adult literacy for 15 years, and I entered the field like many people quite by accident. I just happened to be a part of another program. They were looking for a GED instructor, and they asked me if I would fill in that gap. And I told them absolutely not, because I was not qualified to do that. And I decided to take the position anyway, to at least be a sub until they found someone who was qualified. And it just truly was, everything in my life conspired for me to be there for that moment. And I felt like this is definitely where I belong. And from there, I became a program coordinator for our local community college ABLE program. And from that, I had the opportunity to observe other instructors and their interactions with students, and just really developed a passion for teacher education and teacher quality in adult literacy, because so many people come into our field without that education and training. And I view adult education as social justice work. And to me, you can't have you can have all the best intentions, but you need to have quality and you have to have skills. So for the last 15 years, I've been doing a lot of professional development for adult literacy learners and adult literacy educators on instructional strategies and about how adults learn so that we can use strategies that are effective and be efficient in our instruction. For most of my career, I've done a lot of professional development. I've been an instructor in a couple different programs. I've worked as an instructional designer for an education publisher, which is part of where this story originated for the journal. And my current role is as Vice President of Programming for Seeds of Literacy, which is an adult literacy program in Cleveland with a virtual classroom and sites on the east and west sides of Cleveland. So I've been all over the field and I'm never leaving it.
Carmen, thank you so much. Really appreciate that introduction. And I think probably your story resonates with a lot of folks. I'm not sure, I often say, I'm not sure how many kids in third grade on career day said, I want to be an adult educator. I think that so many of us come into adult education and absolutely fall in love with the prospect of working with adults. And of course, that's one of the things with COABE that our mission is to inspire educators so adults succeed and communities thrive. So really appreciate that introduction and the inspiration that you're going to provide for our folks. So let's talk just a little bit about your piece for the journal. It really was a very personal reflection and a personal account. And it was based upon your experience, as you mentioned in your introduction, working in two different organizations. Could you tell us, first of all, a little bit more about those groups and your work and your roles there and who is served by those organizations?
Well, so the first organization was an educational publishing company, which I won't name because they're not really portrayed in the best light in the article. And I don't want to disparage anyone. But I worked there as an instructional designer for 2 years. And my role initially, at least the role that I thought I would have, would be providing that educational leadership, that instructional leadership to our team. It was not a very diverse team at all. We were all over the country. And for the most part, there were, I think, only 2 trained educators on our and only 2 people who'd ever really worked with adult literacy learners. Contrasting that with Seeds of Literacy, which is an agency that I've been around for almost the entire time that I've been in adult literacy. I've, had lots of interactions with the staff there. I've done professional development for some of their staff. I consulted with them for a year, almost a year and a half before I actually joined the team. And I just feel like it's an incredible organization. I've been working from home for 10 years and wasn't looking to be back out into the working world. And I just couldn't say no because they're such an amazing program. And I think one of the things that I appreciated most about that program and still appreciate about the program is that the students drive everything. The staff is very connected. Our president and CEO, you may see her with everything that she has on her plate. You will see her tutoring math with a student in the classroom if there's a shortage of tutors at the time, because our program provides one-to-one instruction with help of volunteer tutors. So I've seen her do everything from cleaning bathrooms to vacuuming the space. But our students really are the center of everything. Every program change that we make, we form a group of students and we get some feedback and opinions. We've done focus groups with students. We have a student leadership team. We work on student ambassadors. We're trying to involve them in marketing our program. So it's just very reactive and responsive to what's happening with the students. And I think that that's a large part of why there was such a huge contrast between the programs with the events that folded in the summer of 2020.
Great. And Carmen, would you remind us, where are you located?
We're in Cleveland, Ohio.
Cleveland, Ohio. Great. Thank you so much. So yeah, so let's peel this back just a little bit more. And you already shared just a little bit about your piece and working in the different organizations. And so, the reflective piece that you wrote shares 2 different experiences that really had a deep impact on you personally and professionally. And it had to do with the reactions of coworkers in light of the 2016 killing of Philandro Castile, and then in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. So give us some insights into your experience. Share those experiences and why you shared those with our readers.
Well, so I think that when things happen on national news, it is very easy to hear that story and move on with your life. I had just recently read an article written by a man who lives in Boston, and he talks in that article about how he heard about this woman who was this young girl who was killed in a shooting by a stray bullet, and he thought, that's really too bad, and kind of moved on with his life. And the story stayed in the news for a couple of days, and then a few days later he saw it in the newspaper and realized that the young lady was white. And his immediate reaction was he felt worse about her death and had to ask himself, why do I feel worse about her death now that I know that she's a white female? And it was particularly shocking for him to have that revelation because he is a white male married to an African-American woman raising a biracial child. It's very easy for stories in the news to hear us and for us to kind of dismiss it and move on because we're bombarded with news 24 hours a day now.
Right.
With the murder of Philando Castile, I think it really, for me, was the first time that I'd seen such a personal account of it. And it just hit me in a very visceral way. I couldn't not respond to it. I was so emotional because I've watched men of color be pulled over. My brothers, my father, my uncles, I've seen this happen. Either one of them could have been that man. And it tore me apart. And I was trying to figure out how to pull myself together to go back to work that day.
Right.
And I logged on because we had a deadline looming, and I logged on and it was just no one on my staff had anything to say about it. They were talking about things as though, my life was falling apart. And for them, it was just like, oh, business as usual. And I was so upset and disgusted and disappointed. And I just thought, my staff, I had been saying, well, they should, please make the staff volunteer at a program or make them go observe in a classroom because they're writing for students that exist only in their minds right now. And they need to really understand who our students are, what their needs are, and maybe not have such stereotypical views of African-American students, Latino students, and really just understand what the needs are. How do you create for an audience that you don't even know?
Right. And if I can just jump in real quick, Carmen. So we're pretty familiar, I think, overall with the George Floyd case. Could you just give us a little background into the Philando Castile case in 2016?
Sure. So he was pulled over, I think, for broken tail light. There's so many stories, it's hard to keep track of what the initiating incident was. But I believe it was a broken tail light. He was sitting in the car with his girlfriend. Her 4-year-old daughter was in the back seat. The police officer went to the window, asked to see his information. He told the officer, I do have a gun, it's in my glove compartment. The officer said, okay, can you reach, told him to reach for his ID. When he went to reach for his ID, he was shot, I believe it was 4 times in the car. And his girlfriend was live streaming it on Facebook, so everyone could see it at the time. And again, her 4-year-old is sitting in the back of this car. The police officer was having his own personal meltdown because I'm sure it was shocking for him. I'm sure he realized at that moment that he'd overreacted. But basically this man's life, he lost it right in front of everyone on camera. And it was just really, really, really shocking.
Yeah, that was definitely very shocking. And I do recall that incident and so on. And so, but you did find that when you met the next day with your staff, that there was a real disconnect there.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. Yeah. And
I shared that. And the reaction was kind of like, why is she tripping? It was just, they just had no, not even empathy or compassion. And it just was really shocking because this is a group of people who I liked and respected. And it just changed so much for me in that moment.
Right, definitely. I could totally see how it could. So contrast that experience then with the after the George Floyd killing in 2020.
All right. So a lot of that unfolded over the weekend. And I think people, the marches were happening and people were on TV talking about it. And that time, I got phone calls, I got text messages, I got emails from colleagues all over the state of Ohio, even colleagues outside of Ohio, saying, I've been watching what's on the news. This is really terrible. I'm so sorry. Is there something that I can do? And it wasn't like it was my personal tragedy. It's everybody. But the fact that they realized that this isn't just another news story was really important. The fact that they realized that this is an injustice. This did not make sense. This was not justified. This is problematic. And not only that, but now I have a role in this. That was huge for me. It was major to see that. To log on to Zoom meetings and have to, at the very beginning, before we start our business, we have to talk about what's been happening in this country. We have to acknowledge that. To have my staff say, what do we?
Well, I think you froze up there just a little bit.
We have to say something for us. We hear them.
Right.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. You froze up just a little bit, but that's perfectly
Oh,
fine. Yeah. And I think that those contrasting experiences, what do you attribute that to? What do you think?
I think the fact that my staff at Seeds of Literacy works shoulder to shoulder with our students every single day, students
Hmm.
diverse by age, by race, by
Right.
culture, by nationality. I think that having that interaction, it takes people from being an abstract characterization to being a person with an individual character. And I think that made all the difference.
Definitely, definitely. Carmen, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing. I'm going to turn it over to Charisse now. And again, Charisse is joining us from California, Principal Technical Assistance Consultant at AIR. And so, Charisse, go ahead. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work with AIR, and what the connection is with adult education.
Sure, sure. And first, I just want to say, Carmen, that was wonderful. And I too went through exact similar experiences with George Floyd and his murder. And it was a reckoning, I think, nationally and internationally, with everyone seeing the injustices that happen and have happened for decades, and the need to be a part of a movement to do something different about it. Um, I want to thank you, Don and COABE, for the opportunity to participate and continue to elevate these conversations around equity. It is critical, and it is especially important that you're doing it now during Black History Month. And since it is February and Black History Month, I just want to take a moment of personal privilege to celebrate the historic and positive contributions of African Americans in the United States. And when I'm given a platform, I need to do that. And I especially must do that now, as we are able to celebrate and keep that history close and current with us, with the recognition of Kamala Harris being the first African American vice president, the 49th vice president, and also the first South Asian vice president and first woman. So thank you for giving me that opportunity to celebrate Black history as a part of this panel. A little bit about me, and I'm looking at the chat, and yes, there's a lot of feedback and comments on what was happening as it related to why George Floyd elevated this conversation so much. About me, I've been working in adult education for over 30 years, and it would take a long time really to go through all the details. I know we don't have that kind of time, so I'm just going to give you the highlights in short order. I am a practitioner first. I have worked in almost every role in adult education, from being an instructional assistant to being a teacher, ESL, GED, citizenship teacher, to being a program level administrator and director, and to moving into the district office as well. And I've had the pleasure and honor of working in two states, in California and in Arizona. And I see a bunch of folks who have signed in, and I just want to give a shout out to those folks who I know, who I've seen their names come across from California and from Arizona. So thank you for being here this afternoon. Hi, Laura. Probably not supposed to say that, but I am currently working as a principal TA consultant with AIR, the American Institutes for Research. And for the last decade, I've worked on a lot of state and national level projects with AIR. Currently, I'm the project director for the Links Resource Collection and the project director for the Teaching the Skills That Matters project, both which are Octave projects. And in California, I have the pleasure of providing professional development for educators with the focus on administrative leaders. So I work on the Leadership Institute, and I do administrative forum webinars. And I was a part of the development of the MIXA equity domain, which is a part of the article that we wrote for the COABE Journal. I know we'll talk a bit about that shortly. And then just quickly, personally, I am on my local school board, serving as a president for the William S. Hart Union High School District as an elected board member. And I, following the murder of George Floyd, was pivotal in our city starting the Human Relations Roundtable, which focuses on eliminating racism and discrimination in my own community. And that's just a little bit about my background.
Well, thank you so much, Charisse, for sharing that. And 30 years in adult education, I don't know, you were a child, obviously, when you began, but certainly do appreciate that background. So let's focus a little bit on the piece that you were part of the author team of for the COABE Journal. It was a collaborative piece between the Adult Education Office for the California Department of Education and also obviously with AIR, focusing on equity integration initiatives in California. So could you provide us with some additional background on these efforts and on this collaboration with the Department of Education?
Sure, sure. And it was really a great collaborative effort. So AIR runs the California Adult Literacy Professional Development Project, known as CalPro, and we run that for the California Department of Education Adult Education Office. And our focus in that work is to provide professional learning to improve student learning. We were in the midst of really focusing on some large scale efforts in equity, one being the work of MIXA and another being work with a training institute that we have focused on equity. And that began in 2018, and Dr. Carolyn Zachary, who is one of the 5 co-authors on our article, she extended an invitation for me to present at the NAEP National Summit for Education Equity on the topic of charting the path to equity. That presentation was well received, and we received a lot of requests following that to continue similar efforts. And in the following year, my amazing colleague, Sudie Whalen, who is also a co-author of the article, she and I presented together on equity, but we went a little bit deeper. We went to looking more at implicit bias, to stereotypes, stereotype threats, to microaggressions, and to cultural competence. And it really took the conversation to another level. The same time that was happening, we were working with administrators throughout the state to check in with them on what we call the management competency self-assessment, which is a tool that adult education administrators are able to self-assess to see where they have areas of needs within 7 domains, and to put together a plan for professional learning across those domains. We went to the administrators into the field during that time to check to see if the domains and the 21 competencies were still relevant and timely. The results were that they endorsed the competencies, but they also came up with 15 new competencies and a new domain, which is the equity domain. And so we began doing work on equity as a result of that, and defining 5 new domains in the equity area that administrators would have the opportunity to assess themselves on and determine if that was something they wanted to work on in professional development. In doing that, we learned that there was a big gap in terms of opportunities to provide them the professional learning that they needed. And so the Institute, the Success for All Learners Through Equity Institute, began to be developed. And it was sort of timing being everything. There was work that was happening in the adult education office around immigrant integration. There was this work on the equity domain and the development of a new institute on equity. All of that came together with Dr. Carmen Zachary under her leadership, and Dr. Carmen Martinez Calderon, who leads the work of the Immigrant Integration Initiative at the Adult Education Office, and for CalPro under the leadership of Marianne Fidelli McLeod, and of course the institute being developed, the Equity Institute being developed by Sudie Whalen and my colleague Marian Thatcher. All that together, we said, you know, there's this opportunity to share with the field California's commitment and ongoing goal to elevate conversations when it comes to equity and to increase equity and access in the field, and to really celebrate how the field is moving with seeking more and more to be a society in which we recognize that we have to provide equitable opportunities by elevating the conversations around equity in our daily work and in adult education. It's the exact place to do that. And so it was that all of that happening together that led to this article.
Great, great. Thank you for that. And by the way, I do see that there are some questions about how to access the journal. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, but the COABE Journal, where you can access that, how you can access that. So moving on. So the article mentioned California Assembly Bill 2098 that was passed in 2018. So what was the focus of this bill, and what were the implications specifically for adult education programs in California?
So AB 2098, which is the Immigrant Integration Bill signed by Governor Brown, it formalized the ability for us to have immigrant integration as an outcome for program measures in terms of student outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And it really allowed a way for us to recognize the work that we have been doing in adult education with immigrant and refugee communities in California since 1856 and throughout the country as well for centuries. It allowed us to recognize that work in a formal way as a student outcome measure. And Dr. Carmen Martinez Calderon is the lead on that and the work that we're doing around immigrant integration and the initiative in California.
Okay, great. Thank you for the clarification on that. And so you had mentioned already CalPro. Could you tell us a bit more about CalPro and specifically about the Success for All Learners Through Equity Institute?
Yes, delighted to. The Equity Institute, the Success for All Learners Through Equity Institute, wow, it's a game changer and an opportunity that did not exist for adult educators prior to this institute, and ensure you could find opportunities to maybe take training more globally as it speaks to equity, but it really wasn't designed and targeted to our work specifically and to the audience that we serve specifically and intentionally. So there had been multiple conversations happening from the workshops and webinars that were happening around equity through CalPro from the mixed domain. And this opened up the opportunity to really focus on bringing together the need to fill this void with the Equity Institute. CDE had invested money and time into equity and immigrant integration with the Bill 2098. And we thought that there was a chance to go beyond conference presentations. And so that was really sort of the foundation. A dream team was put together with some of my amazing colleagues, and I continue to have to give them shout outs because they were co-authors on this article. So Sudhu Whalen being one of those, and Marion Thatcher. And they identified a team of experts in the state, including myself, who were able to serve as an advisory committee as we looked at equity and really put together an amazing institute and training that allows adult educators across all levels, administrators, teachers, classified staff, and especially classified staff, your first line front staff, to have a training that looks at a continuum of cultural competence and implicit bias. And it uses the cultural competence framework to help you see what actions you can take to move along that continuum.
So what's been the impact of the Institute, and how might it serve as a model, for programs in other states?
Well, again, it focuses on cultural competence and implicit bias. And so that in itself is a focus that I think everyone should think about in terms of some of the comments that we heard from Dr. Stewart earlier, knowing who we serve, knowing who our audience is. If you understand first your own biases, your own implicit bias, it can help you to better serve our students. And if you know where you are along a cultural competence continuum, you can take specific targeted actions to move to a place of cultural proficiency where you really do know and understand the audience that we are serving.
Right.
And so as we've been rolling this out across the state of California, region by region, and it has been extremely well received by adult education programs throughout the state. They are working to build their knowledge around equity and access and diversity and inclusion. The teams, it's a training and institute where you participate in teams, again, with administrators, teachers, and classified. And it has allowed programs to start to develop this shared understanding of the importance of equity and the importance of looking at decisions and how we make decisions through an equity lens. And it really, again, focuses on those who have the opportunity to have the first impression that our students make, the frontline classified staff, as well as teachers and administrators. So as a part of the Institute, you are able to put together an action plan of things that you want to do so that you yourself personally can take ownership of your own cultural competence. And you can look at your programs, policies, and practices and procedures and identify ways in which you can also further improve your equity, access, and inclusion efforts in your programs. So I think it really is a model, because California isn't the only state that is needing to and wanting to and taking action to elevate equity. I think every state, especially in light of what happened last year with the murder of George Floyd, what has happened in previous years where we have seen some of the polarization in our country, I think it's an opportunity for every state to take a look in every program to look internally and see what we can do better. And this is obviously a tool to help do that.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you again for that overview, Charisse. That's really interesting. So we do have some questions in the Q&A area. Let me start off by asking just a general question for either or both of you. What efforts might adult education programs make to discuss and deal with equity issues?
Dr. Stewart, if you want to start.
So I think that the first thing is to have the willingness to do it. And I think that Dr. Moore really just described that it really needs to be in a completely institutional effort. The commitment to diversity isn't about having faces of every color in the classroom, but also having that representation on staff, having that representation on the board, and then not just having people represented, but actually listening to those people once they're represented. So I think that part of it is having the desire to do it. You and I talked before about having the humility to understand that there are some things that you can do better. I think conversations about race are really similar to what I've experienced in marriage, where you can say, you know, that a newlywed couple, a husband leaves this wet towel on the bed and the wife gets angry and he says, "Oh, I didn't know." So now he doesn't leave the towel on the bed, but the shoes are at the door and the socks are outside of the laundry hamper. And he thinks that he's doing better because he's not leaving the towel on the bed, but he's not getting the overall message. So I think a lot of times people feel like, well, I don't ever use the N word and I wouldn't say this and I wouldn't say that, but they're not aware of what biases exist internally. So I think that it's wanting to have the conversations and to really be able to look inward and see how you might be contributing things and how your own personal lens may be preventing you from seeing other perspectives. So I think that that's a starting point, is having the desire to do it. And then making an organizational commitment to have people from all areas, every stakeholder involved in those efforts.
Yeah, and I would ditto that and then add that when we know better, we do better. And as a team, if this was me and my program, it would start with just looking at who it is that we serve, looking at who our students are, looking at the demographics within our subgroups and the programs that we offer, and then doing a parallel look at who it is that's doing the service. And sometimes when you just start to look at that and you see that things may or may not always align with who it is that we're serving, and this is a question that I ask often in trainings is, you know, how do you relate to the students that you serve? And so by starting to take that look, that honest look at the subgroups, the demographics of our program staff and our students, and recognizing what those differences are.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay that there are differences. That's absolutely okay.
Right.
But the piece that you do next is then you seek to understand the ways in which we are alike. Because for programs to really have students feel empowered and to know that they belong, a first step for me in that is really that focus on belongingness, diversity, equity, and inclusion, yes, but how are we alike? That will make sure that I feel like I belong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and thank you for that, both of you. And actually, Carmen, it's maybe a little bit of a follow-up on what you said, but please, Charisse, as well, if you want to chime in. But, in light of the national focus on equity, what advice would you offer to individual practitioners for examining and reconciling their own biases?
Well, I definitely think that reading is definitely helpful. There are so many materials that are written on microaggressions, on white fragility, on diversity and inclusion. There are a lot of materials that are out there. And I think that sometimes these conversations are so full of emotion that being able to have some moments to reflect on things personally and individually, I think that those things are important. I also think that it's important to have interactions with people who are different than you, who have different perspectives and experiences, and to learn how to be open to those differences, to how perspectives are different, how you may see something a little bit differently than other people. I think a lot of times what happens with a lot of professional development around race, diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it turns into a blame game, and people are so laden with guilt and shame that they're not open to receiving it. So I think it's important for people to be willing to open themselves, but I also think it's important for folks who are doing the professional development to start out with, like Dr. Moore said, our commonalities. We all have biases. We've all been fed these messages. We've all, inherited the system that we're now operating in. And I think if you start professional development with those types of conversations, people are more open to how they can contribute and how it is that they might be able to use their privilege to help other people. Privilege is not a bad word. It's a matter of what you do with it. So I think it's a matter of, really trying to reflect on your own positionality, trying to read a little bit more broadly to understand those things that you don't understand, and then participating in the process with an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And there absolutely are many books that you can read that can help to start the conversation. But I would say one of the things that is important for folks to know about is there's an executive order. When we think about this as a national focus on equity, there's an executive order advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. That was signed and put into effect on the day that President Biden was inaugurated. It's one of his first executive orders. And I think it's important to read that and to understand some of the national focus around equity and how this can trickle down into our work in the programs.
Right.
I think that would be a great place. The conversations aren't easy, as Dr. Stewart shared. They're not easy conversations, but they are critical conversations.
Right.
And they are conversations that can move to actionable change.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to have the courage to start the conversations. And so sometimes starting with a little nugget, like a little piece, like just that executive order as a reading that we do as a staff can help us move to, what does this mean?
Mm-hmm.
And, there again are many, many book options that you can look to after that. Invest in professional development. If you're able to have an equity training and diversity and inclusion training similar to what we have through the Equity Institute, invest in that. Invest in your people, invest in your programs to make sure that those opportunities are available. I would also say be honest when you recognize that there are opportunities to do better. It does take courage to do that and to look internally,
Mm-hmm.
starting with that recognition of your own biases. I often have folks go to the Harvard what is it?
Yes,
Project
implicit association. Yeah.
Yes. And that's an easy way to ease into, if you're not comfortable yet recognizing that everyone has biases, and in fact, having those biases can be healthy and is a result of our goal to protect ourselves. If you can just hear that and accept that as okay, then when you take some of those tests through the Project Implicit at Harvard, you'll see that biases come across in very small, different ways. And then you start to maybe internalize and think about, well, if I just have a bias between a butterfly and a bee, what does that mean to me in terms of my relationship with people? And how might I look a little bit closer? And then people often think, thank you for putting the link to that in the chat. People often think that equality and equity are the same. And so that's another place to start, is to distinguish between those two, that they are not the same.
Right. So let me, Charisse, just, there was a question actually specific to you, and you had talked a little bit about some of the tools. The question is, are any of the tools or materials available to those outside of California, or are they proprietary to the state of California? And if they are available, can you provide some insights on how they could be accessed?
So the Success for All Learners through Equity Institute is proprietary to California. However, the MIXA, which is the Management Competency Self-Assessment, is available on our website.
Okay. And that's the AIR website?
The CalPro website.
CalPro website. Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on, let me, here's a question that came in early on. It says, and I believe this is for both of you, it says, do you think vocabulary plays a role in the views on disparity and injustice? For example, as a Black woman, I find the use of killing versus the word murdered in the case of George Floyd and Philando Castile troubling. What are your thoughts on even the choice of wording to describe these race issues, and how do you think students can learn from the discussion?
Yes, the answer is yes. Vocabulary plays a critical role. And when you think about George Floyd, just think about these words: protest, riot, rally, demonstration, all used to describe similar incidences, but depending on who is being described, it goes from being a riot to being a demonstration. So that in ourself exposes bias, because depending on who the audience is that's being described, again, we're going to choose it was a riot or a protest versus it was a rally or a demonstration. So we have to be intentional in understanding how we use words, and understand also that once we use the words and put them out there, you can't take them back.
Carmen?
Yeah, to speak to how to use that with students, I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to do exactly what Dr. Moore is referencing, and look at the way the media portrays different incidents based on who is either the victim or the perpetrator in the incident. A lot of our biases come from what we hear in the media, what we see on TV, what we read in the newspaper. And the folks who are producing those stories are not neutral, and their language isn't neutral. Their values shine through. And so I think a very good way to have a conversation with the student is to give an example of how things are portrayed in the media, and to engage students in thinking about how would this story be told from a different perspective. I mean, this is really silly, but I often use the real story of the Three Little Pigs with my students as a way to introduce the idea that for every narrative, there's a counter-narrative. And for every perspective, there's an alternate perspective. And so helping students learn how to look for that perspective, or to look at something and see, and this is a challenge for us too, to say, who created this artifact, or who created this product? What is their perspective? How did their perspective advance their own agenda? And then what are the perspectives that are absent? And are those perspectives absent intentionally? And I think, even looking at our adult literacy materials, we can look at what what materials and what stories are hold. When we look at our social studies and history stuff, the impacts of women are nowhere on those pages. The contributions of people of color are completely absent. So we can start with, very simple conversations, because these things are brought to our feet every single day in the newspaper. So I think that that's a good place to start with students and helping them to understand the role of language and the power of words and how to use that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Let me just jump in real quick. So we have a bunch of questions, so I want to make sure that we get to them. And I think this would be for either of you, but I think it actually, Dr. Moore, it was as you were talking, the question came in, the difference between equality and equity.
Yes. So, and this is important too in the classroom perspective. Equality, people often think about treating everyone the same, being fair, being, giving everybody the same exact thing. Equity is when you recognize that not everyone has the same exact needs, and your role is to meet students where they are and provide them the needs that they have for wherever they are so that they can be successful. And so, I often use an example that many of you've probably seen before with the student standing at the wall outside of the baseball field. And in that example, you'll see students standing on different crates and as they're trying to peek over the wall at the baseball field.
Right.
Well, one student is shorter, one student is taller, one student is in a wheelchair, and they all have different needs. So you can't give them all just one crate and expect that they'll all be successful and have what they need. You have to meet them where they are. So the child who might need 2 crates to see over the fence, give them 2 crates, or better yet, as we say, take the fence down so that none of them have to look over the fence. But that is a real job that we have to acknowledge and do, and it's not easy, but understanding that trying to give everyone the same thing isn't necessarily helping anyone be more successful.
And Charisse, if I may, 2 things. There was a question about the executive order that you mentioned. That was one of President Biden's initial executive orders, correct? Do we have a name for that one?
Yes, it is Executive Order on Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the Federal Government. I will put the name of it in the chat. I'll do that.
It looks like somebody may have just
someone found it. Perfect.
But another one, if you don't mind, Charisse, if you could please put the link to the CalPro site in the chat so everybody can see. Somebody had a question about that. So if you wouldn't mind entering that in. And I'm going to, let me see, jump to the next question, which is, can you explain the difference between not being racist and being anti-racism from your perspective? And how can this be addressed in adult education classrooms and work environments?
That's a great question. So I think being not racist is just very passive, and being anti-racist is a lot more active and proactive. Being non-racist, it honestly is a very loaded term, because there are very racist people who will fight to the death to say that they're not racist, because they're not knowledgeable about the ways that racism can be demonstrated. They don't look at the ways that they actually help perpetuate a racist system. They're not thinking about how they may be supporting that in a lot of what they're doing, how they're reproducing the same kinds of outcomes that we all live with every day. And I think being non-racist it's very easy to say that, because it doesn't require you to do anything. Being anti-racist, on the other side, is about dismantling systems of oppression. And I think that we're in this country at the point where people are willing to start having the conversations, but I don't know how far we're willing to go, because I think that a lot of the political unrest in this country in the last couple of years has really shown part of why that work is so difficult. And that's because people have a very, they're married to this scarcity mentality that there isn't enough for everyone to go around. And it feels like if someone has to have equality, then I have to give up something. If I have to, if I'm privilege and privilege is a bad thing, then I have to give up my privilege for someone else to have equity, that's problematic. So if we say there should be more voices of color at a table, does that mean that we add more chairs, or does that mean somebody has to step down?
Mhm.
Anti-racists would say somebody might have to step down so that those voices are, more representative of our population. Whereas a non-racist might say, well, I don't have any problem with them being here. I just don't want to hear from them. So I'm thinking about an effort right now to do Black History Month programming where none of color are included in the Black History program. It's just like there's not being non-racist or feeling non-racist, and then there's actively trying to dismantle those systems and not continue behavior that alienates, that eliminates, that excludes.
Thank you for sharing that. Let me redirect to your question that came in that might be of interest, particularly for you, Charisse. The question says, our students are mostly immigrants. Many of them have been through traumatic experiences in their home countries, and some do not want to spend class time reading about and discussing difficult racial issues in the US. For example, last year we read the book Freedom Over Me, that tells about the lives of slaves. One of the students refused to read it. He said he was going through enough tough stuff during a coronavirus and didn't want to read about racism. So any ideas or any thoughts on that?
Yes. And yes, that we're in a time of trauma and people are dealing with a lot. And I think, as we look at reopening schools and how we're going to be welcoming students back, we need to recognize that we are coming back from a place where many of us have experienced trauma. And as I think about opportunities to focus on equity and to have conversations about diversity and race, I'm gonna go back to use what's real. There's so much that's happening every day. Pick up the newspaper, look within your community, and students can learn a lot by becoming the problem solvers. And so flip the script a little bit, and maybe it's not reading the novel, but maybe it is looking at real life and how we can have our students in our classes take efforts through problem-based learning and project-based learning to actually address real issues, things that really are relevant to them right now, things that are really important to them today. And in doing that, they will begin to have the conversations around stereotypes, the conversations around bias, the conversations around race, the conversations that ask, why did that happen to me when I went into the store? Why was someone following me as I did this? These are real issues that folks encounter on a daily basis. And I think you need to bring that into the classroom.
Right.
Can I say though, too, I think that, trauma is so real for so many people, and I understand not wanting to have conversations. I think as educators, it's important for us to introduce topics, but I also think it makes a lot of sense to get feedback from students about whether this is okay or not, and to have them give them opportunities to check in or to say, that's great that this is what you want to focus on, but I'm going to remove myself. So you have to create safe spaces for students in class as well. I feel like we work with adults, they have agency, they have their own opinions, experiences, and we have to respect that. We were planning on, I'm a part of a network of it's called the Adult Literacy Learners and Educators Network that we've started here in Cleveland. And it's a way for adult learners and educators to get together to think about what are the topics that are important to adult learners that can help us as adult educators be better service providers. And with that so our first meeting, we had students that are on our steering committee, and we were thinking, this COVID thing is really huge in the Black community. There's a lot of distrust of the medical community. Maybe we should do our first session about the vaccine. And the students were like, absolutely not. That's a personal issue. It's a very emotional topic. We'd rather talk about something that's a little bit more uplifting. And I think it was a little bit shocking for the steering committee members who are educators, because for us, we're thinking this is so important. Everyone needs to know to do this. We want to get back into the classroom. And the students were just like, that's not where we are. And so I think we have to have the professional humility to realize we don't know everything. As much as we know, we are not the experts on their experiences, and their voices matter. We have to ask, we have to ask if things are okay.
So as we're winding down here, we're just about at the end of our time. And again, I appreciate all the questions here, and I appreciate your insights, panelists, as well as the chat that's going on with resources. So a question came in, said, aside from the articles referenced throughout the webinar, what books or articles do you recommend that will help adult educators start thinking about equity and our schools? Do you have any thoughts on any resources?
Yeah, I have a couple of them. I think Microaggressions in Everyday Life is a really, really good book because I think it helps to show the different ways that you can say things and do things that undermine people's humanity because of who they are, their identity. There's another book called Power, Privilege, and Difference that I think is actually very good as well. I like Robin DiAngelo, but I think that her approach tends to turn people off a little bit. She's the author of White Fragility, and she's written another book for educators called Is Everyone Really Equal? I think that her work is, I mean, I use it with my students, but it's not the first thing that I introduce because she's pretty, she's a little bit in your face because she's done this work and has encountered a lot of people who are resistant to having the conversations.
Great. And actually, Carmen, if you wouldn't mind, could you just quickly jot those book titles in the chat area for the benefit? Charisse, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, I was intentional in trying not to name authors and books because I don't want to appear biased in my recommendation.
Sure thing, sure thing.
So what I will recommend is that you do thorough research and you identify several books that might fit the conversation, but look at them through the lens of what is our intent for using it. Because often people like, they'll say, oh, read, you know, there's one that my school group of leaders is reading, and it was trendy at the time to read the book without really an intent of where we're going from here. So have whichever book you choose, make sure that you have a purpose for it so that, you know, we're not reading this just to read it. We're reading it because we want it to bring about actionable change.
Right, right.
There are also some articles. I think often when I tell people to read about race, diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes it's easier for them to start off with authors from their own racial background because people tend to speak to their people in a different way. But I think it's important that you read some works from Black authors as well. And there are some really good articles that I think people should be aware of as well. And I can share that with you, Don, and you can share it with the field.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank both of you, Carmen and Charisse, for taking the time not only to contribute to the COABE Journal, but also to take the time to serve on this panel. And in that light, I just want to let everybody know, first of all, I'm sorry that we were unable to get to all of the questions, but I do appreciate the questions that came rolling in and everybody's interest and your engagement on the discussion as well. I want to remind everybody that on Tuesday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern time, the next discussion on racial equity in the adult education panel session will happen. If you are interested in accessing a copy of the COABE Journal and information on that, you can go to coabe.org/coabe-journal. You can also go to coabe.org and click on the journal link, which is at the top of the page. Also, we do have the Adult Educator Repository. That link is also on coabe.org, where you can find some equity-based resources as well. If you have any questions about the COABE Journal, any questions about subscribing to the COABE Journal and so on, you can, if you can't find the information on the website, go ahead and you can email journal@coabe.org. So once again, I just want to extend my thanks, Dr. Stewart, Dr. Moore. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for everybody who joined into the discussion, who engaged in the discussion. We will be sending out a follow-up email message in about 24 hours that will include the confirmation that you have attended this session, and also to provide you with the link to the recording to this session. So again, on behalf of COABE and on the Executive Committee and the Board of Directors, I want to thank you all for attending and wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.